Americans for Prosperity North Dakota proudly supported important policy improvements that broke barriers for all North Dakotans this legislative session. From tackling unnecessary and burdensome occupational licensing standards to fighting for tax relief, AFP is proud to have played a part in improving the lives of North Dakotans this year. Join AFP today by visiting www.afpnd.org. This advertisement was paid for by Americans for Prosperity. Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I am your host, Rob Port. Later in the show, Senator Kevin Cramer joins us to take your questions and talk about all sorts of things that are going on. Obviously, the controversy over Labor Secretary Alex Acosta and his past involvement in the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. Alex Acosta was previously a federal prosecutor, and he cut a deal which resulted in Jeffrey Epstein having to register as a sex offender and plead guilty to felony charges and agree to incarceration for a period of time. But some people think that that was too light, particularly now that the sort of secretive multimillionaire, maybe billionaire, I guess nobody really knows how rich this guy is. They feel like Epstein may have let him off. Yesterday, Epstein defending himself. Senator Cramer weighs in on all that as other people demand that he, in turn, demand Alex Acosta's resignation. But before we get there, we live in an era where we spend a lot of time talking about fake news. Certainly the news media bristles a lot when President Trump talks about fake news. They talk about how important it is that we promote the truth. Since President Trump got elected, our news media, the journalists, have suddenly rededicated themselves to the idea of reporting the truth. Now, that's sort of ironic for those of us who think that the news media is biased, because why weren't you this dedicated to reporting the truth before? I mean, was Barack Obama some paragon of political virtue? I don't think that's the truth. I'm not even sure most of his most ardent supporters would agree with that. But anyway, that's what they did, and they don't like the fake news thing. But what happens when the news media themselves promotes fake news? And I'm not talking about, ideological bias or anything like that. Sometimes they just report on things that aren't actually a thing. Now, Disney, which by the way seems to make all the movies. I was reading this article about how the 3 most popular movies for like the last 5 years are all owned by Disney. Yeah, I mean, Disney is a behemoth. Anyway, Disney is doing this thing where they remake their old animated movies with real actors in live action. I guess they've done it with like The Beauty and the Beast and others. I don't really follow this stuff. Those movies aren't really my cup of tea, but whatever. It's something that they've been doing, and apparently it's very popular. And they're going to be making a live action remake with real actors of The Little Mermaid. Now, you'll remember, I think if you had children, the original Little Mermaid was made from, Ariel in that movie was a white girl with red hair. In the live-action remake, they have found a black actor by the name of Halle Bailey, maybe. I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name. Anyway, she's going to play the role of Ariel. Now, if you're a reader of the Washington Post or other media publications, you would probably have seen articles suggesting that there is a widespread backlash to this, that there's people upset that a black actress would be replacing a white character. Only it doesn't really seem to be the truth. There was a viral tweet, right? Somebody posted on Twitter that they were upset about this news, and it went viral, and a lot of people were condemning it. And I guess there was even a hashtag called like "Not My Ariel" or something like that. I don't know, but a lot of people were responding to it. But it turns out that tweet wasn't even real. It was just some troll. It was a made-up account. It was just somebody posting something offensive to get people worked up. And you know what? It worked. In fact, it got so worked up that the Washington Post published not 1 but 2 news stories about it, and there were all sorts of news stories elsewhere. Found out about this by reading the libertarian publication Reason, Robbie Soave wrote there, I quote, "It's true that a few Twitter users seemed genuinely upset about the casting, but the overwhelming majority of the people tweeting #NotMyAriel are doing so in support of Bailey and expressing outrage that anyone would be offended by a black Ariel. Their fury is well-intentioned but largely unnecessary." Well, yeah. But here's the thing. The news media picked this up. The news media reported this as though this were an actual controversy. And you know what? There wasn't. There wasn't a controversy at all. Not really. I mean, maybe a few fringe people on the internet were upset about it. But is that news? That somebody somewhere on the internet is upset about something? That's not news. That's like reporting that airplane lands safely. Right? That's dog bites man. That's not news. But here's the thing. Sometimes the news media makes up news. Sometimes, for as all the complaining we do about President Donald Trump and how, divisive he is and how polarizing he is, and that's all true. He is divisive. He is polarizing. That's his style, for better or worse. But what about when the news media is divisive? What about when the news media is polarizing? Remember, it wasn't some obscure, spammy link farm that promoted this controversy. It was the Washington, quote-unquote, Democracy Dies in Darkness Post, among others. This is a media publication that, again, has repeatedly bristled when politicians like President Donald Trump talk about fake news. Yet they seem fine when it comes to exaggerating a controversy in order to prop up an argument about racism. Don't you think there's enough actual hatred in the world, enough actual racism in the world that we don't need to invent more? Aren't we already divided enough without having to further divide ourselves? Again, the journalism industry likes to talk about the politicians and how divided they are, and they like to report on all these things as though they weren't a part of the problem themselves. But you know what? They are. My interview with Senator Kevin Cramer, up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Senator Kevin Cramer joins me now to take your questions, which I have some submitted. Remember, every week he's on, or most weeks anyway. If you have questions for the senator, you can always email them to me ahead of time, rob@sayanythingblog.com, or if you're following me on social media, Facebook or Twitter, just search for Rob Porter, Say Anything Blog. I put up threads there soliciting questions. That's a way to submit them as well. And we got some questions this week, but first, before we get anywhere, we got to talk about Secretary of Labor Alex Acosta, who has, with the high-profile, re-prosecution of Jeffrey Epstein, who is a man, he's previously convicted of, he's a registered sex offender. He has previously convicted of crimes in the state of Florida, now stands accused of a much broader scope of crimes. And there's been all sorts of reporting over the years about his connection to, human trafficking and pedophilia. And the federal government is now alleging that they have found, kiddie porn, child pornography, in one of his residences. So, but where Mr. Acosta comes into this, Secretary Acosta, is he was the U.S. attorney covering the state of Florida back in the late 2000s, and he cut a deal with Mr. Epstein in which Mr. Epstein was required to plead guilty to felony counts in the state of Florida, to register as a sex offender, to pay restitution to victims, in exchange for the federal government essentially dropping charges. Now, many are saying that that action on his part, on Mr. Acosta's part, when he was U.S. attorney, was that he essentially gave Mr. Epstein a pass. Now you have all sorts of people calling for him to step down from the Trump administration cabinet. Where are you at on this, Senator?
Sure. A couple of things. First of all, with regard to the secretary and his job as a secretary. I think he's been a very good Secretary of Labor. He's not been as aggressive as some people have wanted him to be in terms of rolling back some of the labor regulations and whatnot. But he's been pretty much right down the middle. He's been very helpful to Job Corps. He's been very helpful to the trades, and to helping change a little bit of the policy culture, if you will, as education leans more toward MBAs versus the skills trades and things like that. So I think he's done a good job. He's also done a very good job with healthcare, in the healthcare arena, because he's the person under his agency that set up, of course, the association healthcare plans that I think are one part of the solution to the healthcare crisis in our country. That said, I'm not, I think it's important for people to know that all of the things that he's been accused of having done, the sweetheart deal, if you will, that they call the plea agreement with Jeffrey Epstein back in the late 2008, 2007 timeframe, was all vetted during his confirmation process, way back then. And so there's nothing really new other than the advantage of Epstein still being even seemingly a worse predator and a very, very sick human being, in my view. So I think it's important to step back. I think it's important that the president's reviewing the entire situation, that he's looking into what happened back then. But what's happening today, and what the new charges are, is that they're hideous, heinous, terrible, awful. There's no adjective strong enough to describe it, Rob. But it's all now being put in the context of what happened way back then. And I think we need to put everything in the appropriate context. And if the president and the administration find that something equally bad was hidden back then he should be in a lot of trouble. On the other hand, if look at it and look at the evidence and information that we had at the time that he was a U.S. attorney, and come to the conclusion that he may have made the best deal he could make and still get convictions out of it, we don't have advantage of all that. There's one part of the history, Rob, however, that concerns me the most, and that is that victims and accusers were not informed. To me, that's the one piece of this that I'd like to learn more about. So, right now it's hyper politicized, and I understand that. But that's why I say I think just step back, review the information. If more is about the history of it, and then Alex Acosta will have to answer to that. In the meantime, let's let justice run its course.
Mr. Acosta held a press conference today and addressed some of this. I don't know if you had a chance to see it or not, but essentially part of his defense was saying that, listen, Mr. Epstein this was essentially a state crime, and I've read other people defending him on this front. In fact, I think his second in command back in February wrote a letter to the editor of the Miami Herald, which I referenced in my print column today. But there was a problem where this sort of a crime is typically prosecuted on the state level, or at least what was known of the crime at the time. Mr. Epstein was potentially going to be able to walk away from state level charges. And so what Acosta is saying is, listen, the position I was in, I didn't have a great federal nexus. His second in command is saying that they were having trouble getting some of the witnesses to cooperate. So essentially what they did is they went to him and they said, plead guilty to the state charges. I'm not sure a lot of people understand that. What he actually pled guilty to was not federal charges. He ultimately pled guilty to state charges, was incarcerated at a state facility, or I'm not sure incarcerated is the right word. I think maybe there's some tough questions for some officials in the state of Florida, by the way, because he didn't really actually spend a lot of time in prison. But I mean, that was the deal he cut. Plead guilty to felonies at the state level. And, as far as what his argument is, I sort of used my power as a federal prosecutor to get him to plead guilty to state level charges that he might have fought or might have been able to walk away from anyway. That's his argument. Does that ring true to you?
Yes, it sounds like everything we've heard, and that's all true. I might add, I believe that Epstein ended up having to register as a sex offender as well, which, by the way,
yes.
is,
and he had to pay restitution to the known victims at the time. It was like six-figure payouts. I think it was between like $150,000 to $250,000, something like that. But
in retrospect now, knowing what we know since then, that was not nearly enough. But we didn't know all that then, and the prosecutors didn't know all of that then. They didn't know that he was going to go to New York and have even a worse crime ring, if you will, and abuse even more young people, children, and women of all types. I mean, he's a sick human being who seems to have gotten by with things a lot longer than some might, because he is powerful and wealthy, and that's one of the injustices of our justice system. We see that every day in our system, and it's very unfortunate and seemingly unfair, and is unfair. But that said, again, with regard to Alex Acosta, he had a case in front of him at a given time that had the information he had, and he is making the case that he got the best deal he could get. Now, if that's not the case, I hope somebody will find out and he'll be treated accordingly. But in the meantime, I think we ought to just take a deep breath and let the process work.
Last question on Epstein. It seems like a lot of this is a big surprise politics. Obviously, Democrats are looking to get a scalp in the Trump administration. Let's face it, it gets very frustrating anytime a member of the other side finds themselves in a little hot water. There's those knee-jerk calls, demands to resign. I don't think those are very helpful. But even among some conservatives, I'm reading, this was a post from earlier today on the conservative blog Powerline, and I mean, they're coming after Acosta. They're saying, I'm going to quote now from the blog post, unlike Trump and Senate Republicans, Mulvaney, referring to White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney has direct knowledge of Acosta's performance at the Labor Department. He knows that Acosta stalled the implementation of important regulatory initiatives and, through his agent, lied to him about the reason for the delay. So it frustrates me a little bit. If Mr. Acosta did something untoward as a prosecutor and didn't sufficiently prosecute someone who is a monster like Jeffrey Epstein, fine, that's fair game. But if this is just about point scoring dunking on Acosta because you don't like his politics, either because you're a Democrat and he's a Republican, or you're a conservative Republican and maybe you didn't like his approach at the Labor Department, it seems shocking to me that people would even bring that up in this context.
No, I think that's part of the problem, Rob. And that's why I said earlier that there are some people who don't think he was aggressive enough or has been aggressive enough at Labor. I happen to think he's threaded that needle very well, and particularly when it comes to association healthcare plans and skills training and education. As you know, he came out to North Dakota, met with our tribal college presidents. He met with the trade folks, as well as the skills training and education folks in North Dakota. And of course, associations about association healthcare. So I think he's been a very good labor secretary. But yeah, I think it's no big secret that Mick Mulvaney is much more conservative probably than Alex Acosta, and probably more conservative than Donald Trump. And he may be seizing on this opportunity to, pile on a little bit. And I agree, that's unfortunate. But that said, signing up for government service at this higher level comes with a lot of the junk you have to put up with. It's unfortunate, but it is the kitchen and the heat that comes with it.
All right, before we get to listener questions, I got a question about the debt ceiling. I'm reading a July 8th Washington Post article saying that the U.S. government, and I'm quoting now, the U.S. government could run out of money to pay all of its bills by early September if Congress doesn't rush to raise the debt ceiling. And this is according to a think tank, the Bipartisan Policy Center. So I guess their opinion of what's going on might differ a little bit from what the Treasury Department has to say. But it does certainly seem as though we're coming up on a debt limit increase again. Congress has never not raised the debt ceiling, even though we've played some brinksmanship on that. But it's a little frustrating because I'm hearing a lot of talk from Republicans about, the tax cuts and the economy's roaring and everything else. Meanwhile, we're set to run a budget deficit that's, in the ballpark of $900 billion this year, almost $1 trillion, and we're going to have to raise the debt ceiling again. What are we going to do to resolve that situation? I mean, we're obviously going to have to raise the debt ceiling again, because it seems unlikely Congress is going to pass anything to make that unnecessary. So what do we do, Kevin?
Well, there's really nothing Congress can do to make it unnecessary, because what raising the debt ceiling does is it allows you to pay your bills. So without a raising of the debt ceiling, there's no way to pay obligations that are already accrued. Never mind future spending. That's literally what the debt ceiling does. It allows the continuing of spending. At the same time, and when you say brinkmanship, and why it makes me chuckle a little bit, it's the one time when sometimes conservatives can get some pay-fors, or they get some other policy concessions that help bend that curve a little bit, is at a time like this when everybody agrees you can't default on the government's debt. I mean, obviously that'd be irresponsible, and that would send our economy into a tailspin. So what's happening? And by the way, the policy group that you referenced, or the think tank, I think they are pretty much in sync with the Treasury Department. Now, they may have a difference of weeks, but either way, we will come up against the debt ceiling, and it'll have to be raised, and it will be raised. I don't have any doubt about that. The question is, what else happens in concert with that? One thing the members of Congress have gotten really owly about is raising the debt ceiling as a standalone item, because then you don't have any leverage. You don't get any of these concessions, whether it's cuts in spending in a program, or whether it's some revenue issue or some other policy that bends the curve. I think what's likely to happen, and what's being negotiated right now, is that along with a debt ceiling being reached in mid-September, remember the end of the fiscal year is September 30th, so we don't yet have a budget deal between the House and the Senate, and the White House addresses the caps on discretionary spending. And so my hope is that all of those things get rolled into one package, so that you can, in fact, use everybody's sort of thing as leverage to get something else that deals more responsibly with our budget situation. But even that seems elusive right now, because the gap between Republicans and Democrats on defense spending and other domestic spending is so great, but none of it really deals with the overriding issue, and that is mandatory spending, which is now approaching 70% of the entire budget. And that's not even touched in some of this stuff, Rob. So we have a lot of challenges and a lot of problems. Now, the good news is that the economy has been growing, and that does cushion some of the problem with the debt, but that can't go on forever either.
Well, does it though? I mean, because that was one thing in the Washington Post report, is they said that one reason why this problem is what it is because revenues haven't been meeting expectations from the Treasury Department. So that's one thing. I mean, yes, the economy's growing, but revenues aren't meeting projections that were put in place by the Treasury Department.
Right. So that means that you're going to hear some people talking about tax increases as a means to deal with, with the deficit spending, and other people that will say let's do more to grow the economy, and that helps, and there'll be all kinds of other solutions that they'll be talked about. But we are now in a divided government. That means that it won't be a one-sided deal. It'll either be done in a bipartisan way, or it won't be done at all. And not getting done at all could be a pretty disastrous problem.
Via Facebook, Kyle asks, any updates on the proposed Title IX changes from the Department of Education?
Remind me what the Title IX changes are that they're seeking.
I'm not real 100% certain with what he's asking about. I think that there were some changes coming through related to like how campuses were going to handle adjudicating accusations of sexual assault and issues like that on campus. I think that was the changes. I'll be honest with you, I don't really have a lot of the specifics outside of the question.
Yeah. Well, you know more than I do right now if that's the situation. So we'd have to check on that. That
Sure.
would be obviously a DOE issue. Let me just look into it and see what the latest stuff is. Title IX deals with, of course, sex discrimination. So maybe they're dealing with women's sports, or but it's designed to protect people from the discrimination that's based on sex education programs and other activities, but it may be something more, more broad than that they're asking about. So I wouldn't want to venture without knowing more about the question.
Via Twitter, Twitter user by the name of Native American Dave, or Devi, I apologize if I'm pronouncing that wrong.
Sure.
He asks, how will Senator Kevin Cramer help tribal sovereignty in North Dakota and across the U.S.?
Sure. So a couple of things. I mean, first of all, tribal sovereignty is a fact. It's not, there's not a lot more, quote, to do about it necessarily except to enforce it more clearly. And one of the things, Rob, and this is an area, and I think a lot of the tribal chairs that I've talked to and worked with would probably confirm this. That I've been one of those that has been probably more conscientious of sovereignty than a lot. There's two things. One is, when it comes to sovereignty for a tribe is that they govern themselves on their own issues. It doesn't exempt them from the laws of the federal government or the state that they're in or the city that they might be in. But how they govern themselves is left to themselves. And that creates a government-to-government relationship. On the other hand, their members are still citizens of the state. They're still citizens of the country. They still vote in state and federal elections. And so those of us that are elected, they are our constituents too, and that's sometimes gets clumsy. I would tell you this: in the area, one of the areas where I've been quite a strong proponent of sovereignty is in the area of mineral development, minerals on the tribal lands that belong to the tribe. And some people may question a particular tribal leader or particular tribal policy and how it treats an industry differently than another part of North Dakota, to which I'd say, well, if that's where you're doing business, but it's their mineral, it's their land. Now the tribe has a lot of incentives to do it right, just like states do. So I honor it quite a bit, and I talk about it quite a bit, both at home and out here. But it doesn't exempt them from the other laws of our land and the Constitution of the United States. But a lot of it is just the acknowledgement and then the treatment, if you will, of tribes, tribal people, and tribal governments in a way that acknowledges and respects their own sovereignty.
For the last question, we had a couple of people ask essentially the same question. Mark on Facebook asks, what is his stance on HR 1044? And if he does support it, specifically why? Luke on Twitter asks, I was thinking of asking you, referring to you, Senator, or asking you to ask him why he is co-sponsoring with Kamala Harris the poorly named Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act, but I doubt that that would be productive. So I'll save that question for Representative Armstrong, who I think has enormous potential in politics. So I told Luke I was going to ask you that question anyway, but 1044, sure. Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act, 2 questions about it. Why are you supporting that?
So I not only support it, I champion it. And it was introduced by Mike Lee and myself. Senator Harrison joined us as an original co-sponsor on it. It was something I was a champion of in the House as well. And so that people understand, fairness for high-skilled labor. High-skilled labor references people from other countries, high-skilled immigrant labor, people from other countries who have high skills such as software development, engineering, medicine is a very big one. And they come to the United States on what's called an H-1B visa. There are all these various categories of visas. H-1B are high-skilled. And the High-Skilled Immigrants Act, Fairness for High-Skilled Immigrants Act, does not raise the number of visas. It doesn't raise the number of green cards. What it does is it eliminates the per-country caps. So, just as an example, every country has the same basic cap of how many people can get a green card. So the visas are one thing, but it's the green card which gives you more permanent status and much more freedom in the country to use your skills and your education, if you will, in the United States of America, rather than having people just on a temporary work visa where they have to go back, back to their country of origin on a regular basis. Their children have to go back. Their spouses can't work. They can't work outside of their own narrow lane, if you will. But just to put it in perspective, to get to the specific question, why do I support it? I support it because we should have a merit-based immigration system in this country, and right now we have a lottery-based immigration system in this country. And I believe that you ought to have a system where the immigration system matches the demands of your workforce needs. In the high skill area in North Dakota, 1 out of 20 of our physicians, of our doctors, our medical doctors, are foreign born. They're here. They came here on a visa. In some cases, they have a green card. In most cases, they do not. Same at Microsoft in Fargo, for example. Lots of engineers throughout the state. So we have several thousand North Dakotans who are from places like India. Now, the green card issue, for example, India has the same cap as, say, Greenland. Well, there are a lot more people in India that are in software development, or that are that are engineers, or that are specialty physicians, and that's the specialties are really where there's a shortage in rural America for physicians. A lot more of them come from India than come from Greenland, obviously. So to me, it is a matter of fairness. It is a matter of tapping into the incredible skills and workforce that we gain from H-1B's visa holders. And by the way, they're some of the best people in our communities. I've known lots of them. They've been very good to me. Several took care of my son when he was in the hospital. I've met with them a lot over at Microsoft, at the foreign nationals, have heard their personal struggles, and it just makes a lot of sense that we'd have more of a merit-based immigration system than the one that we have. And the 1044 goes a long ways that direction. But we've also put some safeguards in it, Rob, and this might be part of what's confusing to people. So, like setting much higher salary standards so that a company can't recruit a bunch of folks from, say, Pakistan and then undercut their own workforce, because that lowers wages. What we've done, Mike Lee is like I said, Mike Lee and I did this, and what we've worked with, and we worked with Chuck Grassley, chairman of the finance committee on this, is we've been able to put some guardrails in there to make sure that this bill raises everybody's standard of living and doesn't lower it. And I think that's one of the problems with past incentive programs, is that they have a tendency to bring in the lower cost labor, cheaper labor, rather than higher cost labor, and that, of course, undercuts American workers as well.
I think the argument, and I don't necessarily agree with this, because I generally agree with your position, but I suspect that if the people asking these questions heard your answer, I think what they would say, well, what about the argument, which is deployed very often when it comes to illegal immigration and some of our issues at the southern border, is they're coming here and they're taking jobs from Americans. We've heard President Trump make that argument. Well, these are high-skilled jobs. These are very high-paying jobs. Their argument is, well, you're allowing these people to come into our country and compete with existing workers for this job. How is that fair? Now, again, that's not necessarily a position I endorse, but I imagine that's what their rebuttal would be. Sure.
No, and I think that's a fair rebuttal, which is why we put the safeguards to make sure that it only raises incomes, it doesn't lower incomes. They don't come in and compete unfairly. And by the way, you have to have a sponsor to have a piece of support. In many cases, we educate them. Many times they come here for their education and their training, and then first we send them back to their home country or some other country, get them, and then they become more they become competitors. And we are living in an economy right now, not just in North Dakota, but throughout the country, where we have a workforce shortage, particularly in specific disciplines. Again, this is why I think we ought to have a merit-based immigration system rather than a lottery system or a chain migration system. And I just met with Jared Kushner about this a couple of days ago, because, of course, he has been working on a bill that's more broad-based even than the one that Mike and I have been working on, that will include our language. So we're grateful for that. But they also incorporated some of my concerns into the White House bill that put some standards in for border security and whatnot as well. That strengthens the procurement process, for example, at the border, so that we can make that more efficient. So at the same time, we're trying to keep illegal immigration down. We want to make sure that the people that are coming in here legally are the people that we need to grow our economy and not bring down wages.
Kevin, thanks for your time.
Always a pleasure. Thanks, Rob.
That's it for today's Plain Talk Podcast. Remember, new episodes come out most weekday mornings. If you want to follow the podcast or any of my work, you can certainly do so on social media. Search for Rob Port on Facebook or Twitter, or Say Anything blog. The blog has accounts as well. If you ever have any feedback on the show, email it to rob@sayanythingblog.com. Also, thank you so much to everybody who's rated and reviewed the podcast on iTunes, or I guess Apple Podcasts it is these days. Every new rating, every new review helps boost the podcast and helps other people find it. So if you would, if you haven't done so already, if you would leave an honest rating and honest review, I would certainly appreciate it. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.